Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Gwei Drive-Thru. I'm your host, Anthony Sassano, and today I'm here with Eric Conner to talk about all things Ethereum. Hey, Eric, how you going?
Hey man, how's it going? It's been a couple weeks, but good to be back at it.
Yeah, it's been a few weeks. I think we did say that, we'll try to keep the 2 week cadence, but there's going to be rugs here and there. But we're back today, and there's actually a lot to talk about. I mean, I'm sure everyone has been seeing the debates on Twitter recently, which kind of is giving me vibes of 2019. Remember in 2019 how there were all these kind of debates between like deep Ethereum people, and it was because like everything else was so quiet. And then we had like the bull market, and everyone just kind of, I guess, got distracted by that, right?
Yeah, it's funny like throw it back, right? Like I feel like at the bottom of these bears debates come out. I mean, we've had many in the past. I guess like the first bear was the DAO hack, obviously now infamous, and ETH Classic and debating, should we do like a fork and like all that stuff. And then yeah, in 2019, a little different debate, more around like can the ecosystem funding, right? And like kind of out of that, Gitcoin was born. And it's funny as price goes up, everything's healed with that. Like when it was $80, the EF didn't have much money, and we were kind of like, okay, how are we going to fund everything? And then as price kind of went up, we were okay. But we always seem to like run into these, debates. And like, so I guess if we, like you said, like we're talking Lido and not necessarily specifically Lido, even though they're like in the spotlight now, but liquid staking tokens, liquid staking derivatives, whatever you want to call them. I think everyone's kind of settled on liquid staking tokens at this point. I don't think you or I is necessarily surprised that this debate has come up. And I think we should, kind of give a high level overview of kind of what's going on, but also talk about like why, and this can be kind of the whole episode, I think, but why like Ethereum is at this point, right? I've seen a lot of replies on Twitter is like, oh, you could have just done like DPoS, or like, why did Ethereum do this, right? There's a lot of reasons, like as a community, I think we knew we would get here. It's not really a surprise. I don't think anyone's surprised that, an LST provider is almost at the 33% like dangerous threshold. But maybe Anthony, I'll throw it back to you for a minute, because I mean you have your pulse and all this stuff, and I know you've talked about it a lot in the past. Kind of like what is happening, right? Like why is the Ethereum community talking about this at like a high level? Like what are we talking about before we even go into this subject?
Yeah, I mean, I guess from the highest level, the Ethereum community more broadly believes that no one kind of entity should have too large of a share of the staking kind of market share, right? That's really the broadest kind of highest level I can give in terms of the debate here. Now, I don't think anyone is particularly trying to pick on Lido. It's just that Lido is the one in that position, right? Like if it was a decentralized exchange like Coinbase or Binance, it would be the same discussion. So it really is just about the no one entity controlling too large of a share of the network here. But off of that falls a lot of nuance. People will often just look at like a chart, a pie chart that shows, Lido here at 32%, Coinbase here at, I think it's 14%, Binance here at blah, blah, blah. And they'll be like, oh, if they all colluded, they could take over Ethereum. But that just kind of misses the entire forest for like the little shrub, right? Not even the trees. Like it's just the tiniest kind of part there. And people have been doing this for ages, not just with Ethereum proof of stake, but also with things like proof of work, right? Where like on Bitcoin today, I believe two of the top mining pools have like 50% of the hash rate, and they're actually KYC mining pools as well. But if you say that and say, okay, well, that means that Bitcoin can be taken over by two of these mining pools, that misses all the nuance that comes with that and how that isn't actually the case. And the same is true for Ethereum. And where I get particularly frustrated is when people say, oh, well, in these DPoS or delegated proof of stake networks, there are, distinct entities. Like, for example, people will say, well, there's 30 validators that have that kind of threshold, and they're independent. It's like, well, just because they've got different names doesn't mean they're independent. Like, I hate when people kind of equate these things and say that, and they do this because it's just like an easy thing to see, right? It's for the everyday casual observer. It's very easy for them to like look at this and reason about it rather than talking through the nuance, which I think is what we're going to get into today. But yeah, that's really kind of the highest level debate there. And I think that on Twitter, the debate has kind of bled into not just kind of, I guess, staking, but also bled into how much should we let Ethereum's values kind of define what we want Ethereum to be and how we want Ethereum to react to things. And this discussion is definitely like very deep Ethereum stuff. And I think that for most people, they probably don't have the relevant context to actually get into these debates. And the debates on Twitter, to me, are not healthy, because what ends up happening is that everyone just picks their side based on their own preconceived bias, and they don't actually care about the facts and reason anymore. All they care about is their side winning. So yeah, the debates are tiring. That's why I'm not getting involved in these debates on Twitter. As you said, I talk about this a lot on my show, but that's more of like a one directional kind of approach there. And then I may discuss it with people in the Daily Gwei Discord channel. But generally, the debates on Twitter, they're too messy. Like it's not getting us anywhere.
Right. Yeah. I mean, social forums always end up in a bit of a disaster. I mean, I think the interesting thing is once Ethereum switch, I guess if we step back a little bit, right? Like Ethereum, you need 32 ETH staked. You need to run a node if you want to be a solo validate. Well, you don't technically need to, but most solo stakers run their own node, right? So what is the benefit of these LSTs, these liquid staking tokens, right? It means that, I mean, there's a couple of things. You don't have to run your own node if you don't want to. You can, and you don't have to have 32 ETH. Those are like the two biggest pitches, right? I would think of being using an LST. So you could have 1 ETH, you don't want to run a node, you deposit your ETH, you wrap it, whatever you want to call it, and all of a sudden you're earning interest. And you might do that through Lido, Rocket Pool, and now there's a couple other like Diva and a couple other providers popping up. Coinbase, like you mentioned, a lot of exchanges. There are also a couple other benefits to this, which all of a sudden your token is like wrapped, it's movable. A lot of DeFi protocols like Aave or Compound have added it as a collateral type, and you can use this in DeFi. People would say, okay, well, then what's the benefit of being a solo staker? Well, there still are benefits. A lot of these LSTs take fees. I think Lido takes, I think 5-7% or something like that. I think Rocket Pool takes something like 12. Don't quote me on those, but they're in those ballparks. You don't lose that as a solo staker. As a solo staker, you're not relying on trust. You're not relying on like smart contract code issues. You're relying on the protocol having a code issue, but not like an additive code issue, right? So, okay, we go there. Now, why do people care at this point about Lido? Why am I seeing 33%? There are like two big thresholds in Ethereum proof of stake. One of them is 33%. Like I'm not calling a Lido an attacker, but if an attacker got over 33% of staked ETH, they can cause havoc because they can basically prevent the chain from finalizing. And I don't want to go like too deep into the technicalities on this episode. I mean, we could talk about this for hours. And then the other is obviously over 50%. Those create all kinds of other issues. Lido's at like 32. I think they get as high as like 32 and a half. I think it's down to like 32.2. So people are starting to say, okay, should we be worried a little bit? Because theoretically, this one operator, now they have like multiple nodes and there's all this debate around, are they decentralized or not? Like you said, there's a lot of nuance to this discussion. It's not like if Lido just gets 33%, they're going to attack Ethereum, right? But it's more the optics, I think, for the Ethereum community in general. These numbers do matter. And I think as we approach them, we start to ask ourselves, one thing I will always applaud the Ethereum community with is we never think we get it perfect, right? We kind of got this stuff out there. We got proof of stake out there. We've gotten a lot of stuff. I mean, there's been 7 or 8 hard forks to this point. There's been a lot of EIPs that have gone into the protocol. We are never like, okay, that's it. It's done. It's Bitcoin now. We're never going to touch it again, right? So we're always learning. And I think Lido getting near this first threshold, even though if they cross it, it's not like ETH's going to end tomorrow. It's just kind of like a wake up call and a bit to, hey, should we be thinking of something different, right? And what is something different? I mean, you got to think of Ethereum as the base layer, which is just pure Ethereum running code. You've got a social layer, which is people kind of values and, what do we think as a community? And then you've got like the app layer, which is like Lido or Aave or Compound and kind of what people are running on this Ethereum protocol. And they are kind of all in bed together, right? And there's no, like, I don't believe in code is law. They all kind of run together. And I think we're just kind of waking up as a community like, hey, is this an issue? Like, not only if Lido gets 33%, what if they get 51%? And what if they move to this fully decentralized governance and someone hijacks that? And now all of a sudden you've got these compounding issues. And, again, I don't want to like say if we cross this threshold, it's game over. But I do think there are important conversations to have. And at the end of the day, what matters, it's not like we shouldn't rely on Lido necessarily to self-limit themselves at 33%. We should be asking, like, why does Lido have this much market share, right? And I know some people believe in this like one staked coin to rule them all. I'm not a huge believer in that necessarily. But there are benefits, right, to LSTs. And as a community, should we be thinking about enshrining on the protocol level? Should we be thinking about like how to discourage this through economic incentives, stuff like that?
Yeah, I think the enshrinement conversation is interesting, and we can probably talk about that in a few minutes. But I wanted to hit on a couple of the points you brought up there. So this 33% threshold, as you said, like if one node operator, I should say, and node operator here is defined by an operator that can control, that has control over validators, right? Gets to that 33% threshold, they of course can delay finality on the network. Now, there is so much kind of nuance that falls off of that. And the two main things I wanted to hit on is one, if you do that, right, as a node operator, you essentially get, I guess, like from the view of the protocol, you're essentially offline, which means you're now suffering what's called the inactivity leak. If you're doing it with a lot of other validators at the same time, which would be the case here because you're doing it with 33% of the network, you suffer what's called the quadratic inactivity leak, which means your penalties go way up for being offline. Now, this is in place because it basically means that the beacon chain can heal itself if this attack happens, and essentially it kicks out these validators in order to bring finality back. And timing on this can take a little while, but that's what the beacon chain has built into it to do this. So that attack in particular, I don't really think has any bearing on Ethereum. It wouldn't actually lead to long-term damage for Ethereum. It would destroy Lido if they did this, by the way, or any attacker. It would destroy their business because immediately everyone will be like, well, you just went against the protocol. You cost me money because you're suffering this inactivity leak. I'm going to not stake with you anymore. So actually, I think that it's actually bullish for any one entity to attempt that because they're the losers in that scenario. In my mind, at least. And then the second part is that for Lido to actually do this would require all of their node operators to collude. So I think there's like 30 node operators right now, which have 1 point something% share each. So it would actually require all of them to collude right now, and then for them to gain a little bit more market share to get to that 33% threshold, for them to do that. Now, you could argue that Lido governance could force them to do this, right? Like the LDO token holders could force the node operators to do this. But there is no mechanism currently in place that I'm aware of that allows governance to actually force the node operators to do this. They can do it through social pressure because they could say, okay, well, here's a proposal to force the node operators to basically go offline, essentially, right, in order to delay finality. And when you walk through that attack vector, it makes zero sense. One, because it can't actually happen unless the node operators agree to it in the current stance. Maybe in the future, Lido changes where governance does have control over this. But from my perspective, they don't have actual direct control. They have maybe social pressure, which is a very different thing, obviously. And then two, like the end result is that Lido would just screw itself over, basically, because as I said, like this is only punishing Lido long term. So that's I guess like the main risk at the 33%. Where it becomes, I guess, more of an attack that maybe isn't something that is penalizing to Lido itself is, as you said, like that 50% threshold, where essentially at that threshold, you start being able to propose, basically you're proposing as node operators, as a network, one of every 2 blocks, right? And when you have that much power, essentially what you can do is you can optimize your proposals for MEV strategies, right? You can start causing reorgs to benefit yourself, stuff like that. But that again requires all the node operators to collude, right? Or a lot of them to collude to do this. So again, it's a tall ask. And then there's another threshold that is kind of like probably the worst case scenario, which is 66%. If any, I guess, like node operator or node operators that collude get to 66%, what they can effectively do is halt the chain, because 66% is the threshold for liveness. If you basically go offline with all your validators, you halt the chain, and it would require basically a socially coordinated fork to get the chain back. And it would be disastrous. Honestly, that would be like a nuke going off for Ethereum. We're nowhere near that today. And I do want to just finish off this by saying with the Lido market share, people like complaining about it a lot now and talking about it a lot now in the last few months. If you actually look at the historic market share of Lido relative to other, I guess, participants in the Ethereum staking ecosystem, their market share is the same today than it was in May of 2022 last year. So you can actually go, there's a dashboard on Dune Analytics called like the ETH2 staking dashboard. You can just Google for that. And you can look at their market share. In May of 2022, they were at around 32%. Today, they are at around 32%, right? Yes, Lido's stake has grown, but if you do a relative measure to its market share in measuring it against all the other staking providers, it's actually not grown, right? It's completely in place for almost 18 months now. So when I look at it like that, I look at it as a positive. Basically, because all these other protocols have come online, because we have competition in the staking marketplace, Lido's growth relative to others has actually stopped. Right, it hasn't gone down necessarily, but it has stopped. Now the challenge is to get it down. Like, can we get Lido's market share down to like 20%, right, or 22%? Is like the I guess threshold that people kind of look at. And I think with more competition in the marketplace, we potentially can. But I think that a lot of these debates and a lot of these kind of like social pressures, a lot of the time they don't really move the needle on things. They're good for awareness, but actually moving the needle requires competition in the staking ecosystem. So that's my kind of view on things there. And then that, I guess, like leads us into the other question about kind of enshrinement and this kind of two-tiered staking that people may have heard about. But Eric, maybe this was a conversation we were having actually in DMs. And then I said to you, hey, let's save this for the podcast, where we were basically debating whether it would be worth enshrining LSTs in the protocol, which would mean basically getting rid of LSTs above the protocol and just having one LST called ES-ETH or something that everyone could mint directly in protocol and burn directly in protocol, rather than having these third parties. Or do we do like a two-tiered approach where you still have the third parties, but you have like I guess like pseudo delegation within in the protocol and stuff like that. So yeah, your view on enshrinement, I'd be curious to get on that, or if you had a reply to anything that I was just saying as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said a lot of very interesting stuff, right? And I think so. First of all, I 100% agree with you. I think people, like I was saying, you're not going to get that 33% and everything dies tomorrow, right? And to your point, the real death knell is 66% attacker. If you get there, you're done. And I think there's so much nuance, not only on the 33%, and then it's not just like one Lido person is deciding at that point to run, like what to do, right? Like you said, they have multiple, I think 30 node operators, something like that. And a lot of them are like trusted entities. They're not going to all just say, hey, look, we got 34%. Let's start colluding, right? I think where people maybe get a little confused with Lido is this like decentralization plan they have over like the next 1 to 3 years. I mean, they claim they did this vote to self cap, and they're like, oh no, we voted against it. It was like 99.8% against. But if you look at it, like 3 people basically decide the entire vote. So there's a lot, and they have this plan, which I'll give it to them. I would push back on them and say, hey, why don't you just self limit till you get there? I know why they probably won't do that. But I think from community optics perspective, that would be nice. And so there's a lot going on here. Like Lindy effect is one of them, right? Like if you are the first and biggest staking provider, so people are trusting essentially their money with you, right? They're saying, I want to stake with your provider. Why does Lido have dominance? Because other people have trusted Lido. And we talk about Lindy effect a lot way back in the day with like Bitcoin, ETH, and like people just, you become to know it. And that's the Lindy effect, right? You're like, oh, my neighbor's doing it, so I'm going to do it, whatever. They trusted it, so I'm going to trust it. And you just become like this name. And it becomes a bit unstoppable. And I know I mentioned earlier, like there are a lot of people, and I believe the Lido team thinks this, there will be one staked ETH to rule them all, essentially. So like people think there will just be one staked ETH because of Lindy, because of network effects. I don't agree with that, because I think if you agree with that, you think you also have to believe there's a fee race to zero. So if you're taking 5 to 10% of a staking fee, if you think there's going to be 100% winner, people are just going to keep undercutting you, right? So I expect the new thing to be someone launches and they say, hey, we have a 3% fee. People hop over there because they're getting a higher return, right? So there's going to be a battle there for a while. And I don't think you're ever going to get to like 100%. But if you get anywhere near that 50, 66%, it gets cautious. And I think it's not necessarily that Lido's getting a 33% and we all think they're going to attack. I think it's more for like the optics because it's like putting eyes on what could happen. And to be a little self-reflective, I've hit on Bitcoin for saying, hey, 2 or 3 mining pools own the hash power. What if they attack Bitcoin? It's kind of the same thing, right? And Bitcoiners sit back and say, well, they never would. You could switch your hash rate over and like there's no reason. It doesn't make economic sense. It's kind of the same thing, right? And I don't love that we've put ourselves in that similar situation. And I especially don't love that the protocol doesn't really benefit solo stakers. And how it's like written, it's very hard to do. But it's a hard pitch, I'll be honest, to solo stake. Other than, oh, you're just kind of you're a solo staker and you're cool and you're adding decentralization, right? Maybe you get like slightly higher yield and you can run MEV boost by yourself. But it's a tough pitch. And like, I know why we designed it this way and why we didn't go DPoS and we wanted hundreds of thousands of validators and it has worked out great. But I think a little self-reflecting around some of these ideals is important, and like seeing why so many people are using LSTs is an important thing to look on or look at. But to kind of move on into your question, enshrinement, right? So right now, all third-party operators run liquid staking derivatives. Like if you don't want to solo stake, you take your ETH, you wrap with them, and you just trust these third parties. Now, there is a scenario where the Ethereum community could say, hey, let's just make this part of the protocol. And this was a conversation 5 years ago, right? And essentially, instead of just saying, hey, I can only just lock my 32 ETH and it's part of my validators and I'm running my node and I can't move it, you could have this. And there's a lot of technicalities here that I don't want to get into. You could essentially, let's say in a very easy world, stake your ETH, but you could also say, hey, I want this to be a wrapped movable ETH that I want to use in DeFi, and it credits you with, like you said, let's call it ETH staked ETH, ES and you get that and you can move that around and you cut out third parties. Now, like you said, you and I were having this conversation and you had some good points where it's like, okay, well, how does this, you still have this problem with node operators, right? A lot of people don't want to run their own nodes. Why won't enshrined stake ETH just run into the same problem that we've seen in Lido and exchanges and huge whales that have big infrastructure and they can run their own nodes? Why won't they just attract, all the ETH and then we're back to square one? All of a sudden Coinbase they're the biggest node runner and they have 66% of the ETH. It's a very good point. I think this 2-tiered staking system, which I'm just kind of like reading and trying to digest over the last week, like wrap my head around, is an interesting thought. I also think you could get maybe like a little creative with requiring people to run their own node and they get some benefits. But again, that's a very technical conversation. But I do think, Vitalik just put out this blog post, very timely, I guess, about a week and a half ago about enshrining things in the protocol. And Ethereum has been anti this, not anti, but we just haven't done it yet. Like we haven't enshrined things on a protocol level. We've let the free market kind of just take a stance. And I'm not a big fan right now of these takes of that Ethereum is free market maximalism. I think Ethereum is decentralized maximalism. And if a free market participant starts threatening it, I think it's up to the base layer, which to me is the base free market. Anybody can submit changes to Ethereum. It's up to that actual free market to respond, right? I don't think the argument of, hey, it's a free market, you can't possibly like come after us on the base layer. I don't find that argument valid at all.
Yeah, I think there's two things I wanted to touch on there. The first thing was like how you alluded to, like it's all about the node operators, right? It doesn't matter which way you have staking implemented in your protocol. It's all about the distribution of node operators, because the number of validators on Ethereum doesn't matter, because the number of validators, the reason why we optimized for a lot of validators was because of the original sharding designs. And because we've abandoned those, that's actually tech debt now. And there are proposals that are going to get rid of the max effective balance cap, which means that the validator count will actually come down because people will be able to consolidate their validators. So the way this would work is that instead of having, if you have 320 ETH, you have 10 validators to run that on, you would just run 320 ETH on one validator, right? And you'd get the same rewards. It all worked the same. You'd just be able to consolidate. And this is actually needed for a network health perspective as well, because the overhead of having so many validators is really large, and we don't even need it anymore because we abandoned the old sharding designs in favor of the new dank sharding designs. But again, it comes back to the actual full nodes themselves, right? What's the kind of full node count look like? Like how many full nodes exist? And obviously validator, you can have like 1,000 validators running off one full node. You know, that's kind of how it works. So as I said, validator count is not representative of anything really. So it's all about the number of full nodes, but then it's all about who's actually running these full nodes. You know, who are the node operators? Are they decentralized themselves? Are they distributed across the globe? Are they individuals? Are they companies? Are they bad actors? Are they good actors, right? Like who is actually running this? It's impossible to ever know who's running all of them. You can obviously make educated guesses based on what we see today. Like obviously Lido node operators are running a lot of full nodes. They probably have them for, you know, production and for backups and stuff like that. And then you have the centralized exchanges that are running them as well, not just for staking, but also for processing user deposits and withdrawals on chain and things like that as well. So all of these entities are running them. But, you know, I know for myself that I'm running a multiple full nodes at home for my staking setups. I know you're running full nodes. I know lots of individuals that are running them. And then you have to think about, okay, well, what you got to split this up. So there are what I like to call economically kind of like economically important full nodes, right? And these are the ones run by centralized exchanges. These are the ones run by staking service providers, because they're actually taking in stake from other users, and essentially they're the trusted entity for those users, right? So they're very economically relevant, especially centralized exchanges, because they hold a lot of weight in different things. They hold a lot of user assets. They process a lot of activity on the network, and then you have like the more long tail, which is the individuals running the full nodes. And these individuals may not be as economically relevant, but they're very socially relevant. They are the ones on, you know, obviously crypto Twitter. They are the ones on the various kind of like Ethereum governance forums. They're the core devs, the researchers, things like that. They're the people that are actually getting involved in these discussions, because you don't see Coinbase as an organization getting involved in Ethereum governance, right? There may be people within Coinbase, for example, like Jesse Pollack, the lead at Base. He's very, very active there. But Coinbase as a whole organization, you know, is not getting involved. Brian Armstrong's not sitting on core developer calls and stuff like that. He's not on Twitter debating these things, right? And the same is true for like Binance with CZ and things like that. But it's all about kind of that, and it all comes back to the social stuff. And that's why I think node operator decentralization and distribution is much more important than anything else. And this goes back to what we were talking about with enshrinement. And my argument to you was that if we had an enshrined ETH at the base layer where everyone had equal access to the same LST, basically, as we said, it was ES ETH, everyone can mint and burn it the same way. There is no advantage. There is no kind of, I guess, like incentive for anyone to align themselves with any one kind of, I guess, entity tapping into this. We're just all aligned with this one thing. Well, then it becomes a kind of thing of, well, in that world, it's obvious to me that centralized exchanges would dominate because they've got the easiest onboarding process out of anything. Even Lido is harder than centralized exchanges, because to get involved with Lido, there's a few more clicks to it. Whereas with a centralized exchange on Coinbase, it's literally like 2 clicks last time I checked to stake your ETH, right? It's very, very simple. And also Coinbase is a very trusted entity, especially people who are using fiat to on and off ramp and stuff like that, right? Lido doesn't have as much Lindy as something like Coinbase, and doesn't have much brand awareness. Same with Binance. Same with things like other exchanges. So if they've got access to the exact same LST that everyone else does, it kind of like points to me that the stake would just completely centralize around these entities, because you would have no one promoting other projects, because there would be no incentive to do so. Like a lot of people promote Lido because they're holding the LDO token, right? A lot of people promote Rocket Pool because they're holding the RPL token, and they also align with the values of these different projects. But if you just have one LST to rule them all, basically enshrined in protocol, there is none of that. There is none of that social kind of layer pressure. There is none of that, none of those incentives. The incentives really are just a race to the bottom on fees, as you mentioned, right? Where these exchanges just keep undercutting each other. They can basically set fees to 0% just to get market share, and then jack the fees up once they've got the market share. This is a common tactic. This is not anything new, right? This is used in every industry, basically. where it becomes a race to the bottom. And then once you've got people locked in, you jack the fee up. Because if you're an exchange and you lock people in at 0%, and then you just say, okay, well, we're raising it to 5%, no one's going to care. Most people aren't going to care enough to change who they're staking with. So I think that an enshrined, like a purely enshrined staking token, LST, wouldn't actually solve that issue, because the core issue is node operator centralization, and how we get around that. And an enshrined LST, in my mind, wouldn't fix that. Now, as you mentioned, there's also this concept of two-tiered staking, which, I mean, there's a post here. I've got it up on my screen here. As you said, like, it's still relatively new, and it's not. This post is only 24 days old, but basically it kind of like posits this change to Ethereum staking, where essentially you have two tiers of staking. You have something called operator bonds, which is, from my understanding, the current way staking works, where you basically have to go through the entry and exit queue, and there's capital on the line, and then you have like a delegated stake, where essentially this delegated stake could be moved around like it is in a delegated proof of stake system, and then the users who want to delegate their stake don't have to go through the exit queue to remove their stake, and can do it without the permission of the actual node operator. This, to me, is probably the best middle ground kind of solution here, because you still get the competition at the node operator level. You still have node operators that have to put this bond up, right, essentially to become and stay node operators and to participate as one. And then you also give the users the option of still delegating their stake, right, the same way they do today, but in a much more trust minimized way, and in a much more fluid way, where essentially you don't lock them into that kind of deposit and entry queue, and they can just move their stake if they feel like that their stake is at risk, or maybe they just want to change providers. And it basically lowers the barrier to of those switching costs, because switching costs are always really high for these sorts of things. So it lowers that. That's my understanding of it. But the post itself, if people want to Google it, it's just two-tiered staking. You can go check that out. But that's my general view on Enshrinement there. But this is a lot of open research stuff going on right now. It's probably not going to come to the protocol anytime soon. But as I was saying before, I really think the risk of Lido at 33% is completely overstated at this point in time. I think that long-term, obviously, we want to deal with this, and we want to make sure that they don't grow more than what they have, which I think has actually been happening, as I said, for the last 18 or so months. But we want to encourage competition as well. And that's what I've been focusing on. That's why I don't get involved with these debates. I've just been focusing on promoting the competition, telling people, hey, don't stake with Lido. They've already got enough stake. You can go with other providers, and go with, who you trust, obviously. You even going with like a centralized exchange is better than going with Lido at this point, because they've got less market share here. And the final thing I'll say before I hand it back was that the kind of like social signaling around that 22% self-limiting thing, to me, has done more damage than good at this point in time. And I know this may be unpopular with people, and I have friends, like good friends, that have been advocating for this. But the reason why I think it's done more damage than good is because Lido is not going to self-limit to 22%. They're already over that threshold, by the way. But also, if they voted to self-limit, that means the LDO token's going down, because it basically means that Lido says, oh, we're going to remove our market share voluntarily, right, in order to, I guess, align with this 22%, which means that the growth is capped, and the growth is actually negative now for Lido, which means the LDO token is going to get reevaluated. So no rational LDO token holder who wants their token price to go up is going to agree to that. And as you said, it was dominated by 3 people anyway, who are obviously large LDO holders, but also have a lot of stake delegate, or a lot of LDO delegated to them. And also, the other protocols that have aligned with this, they're nowhere near 22%. And there probably isn't a reality where they ever get to 22%, right? So for them, it's very easy to virtue signal this and say, oh yeah, we'll self-limit at 22%, when they know themselves that they're never getting there, right? So I think that, as I said, it's probably done more damage than good, because it's made a bit of a joke of the Ethereum kind of like social layer platform of things, and it's very easy for people to make fun of. But yeah, my whole kind of thing is, let's just encourage competition, right? Let's make people aware of the issue and get them to switch from Lido to something else, or get them to not stake with Lido to something else. But the self-limiting stuff, it's just not going to work for the reasons I just outlined.
Yeah. All right. Lots to unpack here. I'm going to go with the recent comment here around the Lido token. So obviously agree. I don't think that any rational company would self-limit when it comes to like revenue. Now, my pushback on that would be, no Lido token holder is getting any revenue share. They're getting a false promise of governance, and I get it. Valuation of the token. I agree with you. It's yes, self-blaming would be silly from their perspective, but there are now social signals which maybe optic wise don't look so good to them. From it's not like Lido token holders getting a share of revenue from the stake that's happening on the network, right? Which, by the way, I'm shocked that no one's doing that. Like, why is no one saying, hey, as a token holder of my LST, we're gonna haircut just like a little bit off of our stakers yield, and instead of just taking 10% to ourselves, we're gonna give like 1 or 2% back to token. I still This goes back to Uniswap and all these DeFi companies, right? Like companies, whatever you want to call them, protocols. But why is no one thinking of this stuff now? Maybe that's a great vampire attack conversation that we'll save for another day. But I think I want to hit on the social layer, right? Because I think this whole conversation depends on understanding what Ethereum social layer means, right? And like when you say you're not scared and the debates aren't worth it, when we're just over this 33% number, to an extent, I agree. I think I think being loud in debates, and both of you and I have done this over the years in Ethereum, just being loud on Twitter, that's where the Ethereum community is valuable because it like wakes people up. And in a way, you have to like just be obnoxiously loud about some subjects so that people keep seeing it, right? Especially in a bear market when like not many people are around. But like, what is the social layer of Ethereum? And it's what you summarized well earlier. If you go over 33%, those 40 Lido node operators are not going to instantly collude to like take down Ethereum, right? And that's a social layer aspect of Lido itself. The social layer of Ethereum itself are the people kind of between the protocol, the app layer, the node runners. Like there's like this gray line of where people are. And I think just kind of signaling this debate kind of activates that social layer to an extent. And that social layer is that last line of defense where even if a bad actor were to get 66+% of Ethereum stake, as an Ethereum community, we could just all get together on Twitter, as ridiculous as it sounds, on forums, on Discord, and say, hey, F this guy, let's fork him out. This isn't Ethereum as we know it. We're going to fork and we're going over here. And this new 32% community that we have, this is Ethereum, right? And if the apps and if the devs and if the social layer follows you to that side, that attacker just burnt a ton of money. And I think this is that nuance that you keep hitting back on when it comes to this is if Lido got 40%, 50%, 60%, it looks very bad optically and it creates a lot of debates that I think we should be having, but it also is not like tomorrow, even if they were to attack, it would cause a lot of drama and probably a dip in ETH price in the short term. The social layer would get together and say, screw Lido, we're forking them out, we're launching new nodes and we're going over here. And now this is Ethereum. And look, we learned that lesson, right? So I think people forget, and I hate this. I'm seeing like code is law again on Twitter, and I just hate it. Grinds my gears. I just hate it so much because it's not. It's so much of blockchain, it's social layer. And even Bitcoin's monetary policy is social consensus, right? Like everything is. Anybody tomorrow could say, hey, there's a big problem in Bitcoin. We need to add inflation. Boom, done. Like nothing is actually code is law, right? And in a way, this like Lido debate has been a flashback to the ETH Classic debate now, because you got this like code is law side, which is like free market. Hey, actors can do anything. And then you've got this like other side that's saying, well, there's a social layer and this might not happen as you think. But I'll be honest, in a way, it's been a bit like re-energizing to finally like have something to talk about as a community and not just talk about charts and price and things like that. And I think one of the really important points is we've thought like validators being out there, we didn't go with DPoS, which is great. But at the same time, at the end of the day, it's the node runners, like you were saying. Like in ETH1 nodes, we were always trying to encourage people to run it. ETH2 nodes, we're once again trying to encourage people to run it. And maybe should we be looking at that? And I don't have the technical or the like expertise, or I haven't thought about the economics behind it. but like, is there a way to properly encourage people to run nodes? And I know there have been thoughts in the past around this, but we always come back to this, right? Like, who's actually running the nodes? And you and I in DMs, you had a good point. Like, to the protocol, a node run by Coinbase, a node run by myself is no different. But like, maybe is this an area where we should be like researching a little bit and trying to economically incentivize like good actors and spreading, but it's tough, right? Like, I actually don't know. I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, but I feel like that's an area of research. And I never, by the way, want to ever doubt, like, to your point, enshrining on the surface seems like maybe it would just centralize, but then all of a sudden you're like, oh, this two-tier staking sounds kind of cool. Like, I will never doubt the Ethereum research community. And I think these debates in general are just good to have, because we're kind of like, all of a sudden everyone's brains activated again. We're not looking at charts. We're not looking at like ETH going down over the last 2 years. Like, we're having these thoughts again. And I think that's always beneficial in this community.
Yeah, I think on the topic of how to encourage more full nodes and stuff like that, I think all of that has to be done extra protocol. And what I mean by that is that from what I can tell and all of the research that I've done myself, it is actually impossible to have the protocol be able to distinguish between, as you said, Coinbase running a full node and yourself running a full node. For the simple fact is the protocol only sees a validator, right? Only sees a full node. It does not see you, does not see Coinbase, and it cannot see that without an external data source, which just adds centralization vectors. You know, for example, you could have a Oracle feeding in data saying that, okay, well, this is Coinbase's node and this is Eric's node. But then you're trusting the Oracle, right? You're not trusting Ethereum's kind of, I guess, system anymore. You're trusting this external dependency, which is fine for things like price oracles, especially when they're constructed in such a way with like Chainlink, for example. But it doesn't work when for the actual kind of consensus of the chain and for things like full nodes. The other solution, which isn't a solution at all, and obviously I would never advocate for this, would be to do KYC, and the protocol would only allow KYC things in, but then you still have a dependency on a third party, because who controls that, right? And all of this just comes back to the topic of like Sybil resistance and being able to kind of put identities to on-chain actors, which is, in my mind, basically impossible to do at the protocol layer. So, okay, if it's impossible to do at the protocol layer, how do we do this extra protocol? Well, there are a few different ways we can do this in terms of encouraging more full nodes and more distribution of full nodes. There are various projects in the works and right now, something called like Project Solo Staker, which essentially they just send people hardware and they can run the full node in this little box in their house, and they basically do it for free. And then there are other things like DVT, or distributed validator technology, which essentially splits up a validator into various different parts. And, you know, I'm in a cluster right now, an early cluster with Obel as part of their alpha testing, where essentially there's 4 of us running in this cluster, and we're all running the validator software and the full node software on our own hardware. And the 32 ETH is split amongst 4 of us. It's actually kind of Obel's 32 ETH. It's not ours right now. But the way this would work is that all 4 people would bring their 8 ETH. They would pull it together. They would have the 32 ETH, and then they would all run the software and the full nodes, which does on net increase the number of full nodes in the world, and actually increases potentially increases the distribution as well. And I codenamed, I don't know if I don't think I came up with this term. I think it was David Hoffman or Ryan Sean Adams. They came up with the term of squad staking, which essentially you get your squad together and you stake together. But it's not just in terms of kind of pulling your ETH together and staking all on one node. You're actually running the validator software, the node software yourself, which is, as I've been saying, is what we want to encourage, right? With the node, we want to encourage more node operators, more full nodes, more distribution of node operators. So from all my, as I said, from all my research, the extra protocol stuff is the only real way to do it. In protocol, it's basically impossible, because even as you were alluding to before, you know, you said, well, why can't we, I guess, like reward solo stakers more than pooled stakers? Well, because as I was saying, as we both said, to the protocol, Coinbase is a solo staker, because Coinbase's validators are the same as my validators, right? The exact same thing. And the protocol does not know and will not know how to differentiate between the two in order to reward solo stakers more than Coinbase. Now, where this two-tiered staking thing comes in, and where it's beneficial for, I guess, like for solo stakers, is that they can essentially allow stake delegation, stuff like that to them, which essentially means that they could earn increased rewards from fees and stuff like that. So essentially you become like, everyone becomes like a Lido, for example, right, where you get delegated stake to you, while still having that node operator bond on there, so you can still do all the slashing and stuff like that and have distribution of stake and all that goes into that. So that's my kind of general view on that one there, and why I think, yeah, it's unfortunately not possible. And keep in mind, this applies to every single blockchain, right? This is not an Ethereum specific problem. This is a problem for every single blockchain. Doesn't matter if it's proof of stake or proof of work. It's always about the distribution of stake or hash rate and the distribution of the actual node operators, which the node operators are actually the most important part. It doesn't matter about stake or hash rate. I believe the node operators are definitely the most important part. And as you were saying with the social layer, at the end of the day, the social layer is like the bedrock. The node operators exist on top of that. But at the end of the day, if enough of the community got together and agreed on a change to the protocol, the change goes through. And this even happens to the holy 21 million Bitcoin cap. If enough of the Bitcoin community got together and said, hey, we actually want to increase the cap, or we want to add inflation to Bitcoin, and it's no longer going to be 21 million, that would happen. And there would obviously be a minority fork where the community that didn't want that would go on. But if the majority believes that this is now Bitcoin, that becomes Bitcoin. The same is true for Ethereum. Same is true for any public blockchain out there.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing, I guess, going back, is on that, say we enshrine it, have this two-tier staking, and anybody can become like an LST, basically. The interesting thing is, like, anybody can just spin that up at that point, right? Like right now, to become a Lido is very complex, but to become like a node operator enshrined on the protocol, you kind of just set your fee, you set like your uptime based on, and like people can, now again, this is probably a race to the bottom, because like if you're the best fee and blah blah blah, but I still think maybe you could put some in protocol incentives in at that point, or disincentives for centralization around stake. Probably getting a little technical here. Now, one thing I want to hit on, and I don't think enough people are talking about it, is recently, at least in the US and I think in a few other countries, it was deemed that, so as a staker, you stake your 32 ETH, and every like couple days you get withdrawals that come in, and it hits your account, and you bring in your ETH withdrawals. In the US, that's deemed a taxable event. So even if you don't sell that ETH and you just sit on it, you have to pay tax on what ETH was at that point for how much you brought in. The liquid staking providers are offering different ways to not get around that, but like that aren't taxable events. So like wrap stake ETH, which is Lido's thing, instead of every day you claiming and getting ETH, the value of that token you're holding just goes up, right? And that's not taxable until you sell that. That's a huge advantage. Like personally, I've thought about just stopping solo staking and going to that, because I have to pay tax. Like even if I don't want to sell my ETH coming in for as a staker at this price, I have to pay tax on it. So in a way, I'm forced to sell at least 30% of my ETH that comes in, right? And I don't want to. I'd rather just accumulate it. Whereas if I wasn't a solo staker and I went to Lido and I used wrap stake ETH, I don't have to touch it. I just let it accumulate and I don't pay tax on it. So I think, and I have a hunch that that's bigger than people think. Like I think most people using Lido these days, maybe not most, but a good portion are realizing this, and that's one of the reasons. And maybe just something as simple as like tackling these smaller things like that on the Ethereum protocol side. And I know like that's a US centric view, but I think I don't know how Australia does it. I don't know how Europe's handling it, but I would imagine that's like somewhat of a common viewpoint. And I don't know what percent of ETH stakers are, in the US. I would assume a pretty good portion of it, but I think these small things of like more not asking Lido to self-limit and asking Lido to do these things, but asking ourselves as a community, like, why are people using LSTs, right? And I think it's beyond just running a node and stuff like this, and all of that can get easier. I mean, I've been one of the biggest pessimists at the actual staking process as a solo staker. Like, it's almost a joke in my opinion, like, you know, trying to launch your own. So now DAppNode, I use DAppNode now and I can't speak highly enough about them. Like my life's way easier of getting in and out of staking. But the actual like launch pad from Ethereum and like it's a pain. So there's a lot to learn as a community of why LSTs are taking over, and I think that needs to be part of the conversation as well.
Yeah, I think I can give just a few of my reasons here. Maybe we can wrap it up since we've been going for quite a while on this topic. That we could go for hours and hours. We didn't even touch on things like MEV and stuff like that that comes into it. But essentially, the reason I think Lido grew to what it is today, and as I mentioned before, Lido's growth relative to other services has actually stopped for the last kind of like almost 18 months. But the reason why I think there was a few reasons why I think Lido got to where it was. One, and the biggest reason, first mover, right? It was the first LST out there. It was probably it came before Binance staking. I think it even came before Coinbase staking, right? So it was like the first kind of place where you could stake without running your own kind of validators, right? One of the first, and it gave you the LST, which has obviously been really important for people who want the ability to quickly exit if they want to sell their ST into the market, or if they want to use it in DeFi, things like that, right? So that's the biggest advantage they had. Second advantage they had, which I think is under talked about or under discussed, is that they launched long before withdrawals went live. So what this meant was that Lido's stake could only go up only. The only way you could exit was selling ST ETH on secondary markets. You could not exit by going to the beacon chain and saying, hey, I want my ETH back, because the withdrawals weren't enabled. And the reason why I think this is a big part of it is because think about all the stake that actually exited during the crash after the bull market. And the quintessential example of this is 3AC. They had a lot of ST ETH, right? A lot of it. And instead of going to the beacon chain and withdrawing the ETH directly, they just puked it all on the secondary market, right? Because they were basically needing the money because they were basically blowing themselves up. But what this did, and it's not just them, it's a lot of different players, but what this did was it didn't actually affect Lido's market share at all, because by the time withdrawals came to the Ethereum mainnet, the ST ETH price was back at fair value. So it had actually gone down, I think at most 10%. So it was at a 10% discount to what it's supposed to be on secondary markets. Now, if withdrawals was enabled, what do you think was going to happen there? People would buy ST ETH and then go straight to the beacon chain and say, hey, give me 1 ETH for my 0.9 ST ETH. And then that's free money, right? It's free ETH. But you couldn't do that at the time. So Lido's market share in terms of validator count didn't go down at all because of that. And by the time withdrawals were enabled, it was back at fair value. So there was no arbitrage to be had there. So a lot of Lido's stake is actually grandfathered in because of that. So those are the two main reasons they grew so much. Now, the third reason obviously is because they made it really easy for people to stake, right? It's a very easy process. But that is kind of falls off of the other two, or falls off of the first thing about how they were a first mover as well, because it's just as easy to stake with other services too. I mean, as I said, it's easier with Coinbase, for example, right? But I think that the second point about how a lot of stake is grandfathered in is very under discussed. And we actually have, and obviously Lido has been growing on a kind of like real basis where the amount of ETH stake with them has been going up, but on a relative basis, people have been staking with other services as well, right? There's so many other services now. It's not just LSTs, it's also these institutional services as well that are getting stake in from these institutional players, and these are the entities that people don't even know about. So that's my kind of view on why Lido grew so much to this point, and why they've kept the growth is because honestly they have a good product. Like, I'm not going to deny that at all. They've got an awesome product, but at the same time, their product is not a moat, right? Their product is not something that they can that is very defensible. I think what's defensible is ST ETH Lindy, right? It's liquidity effect. It's I guess like integrations within DeFi. It's marketing. It's branding. But its actual kind of product itself is very commoditized. Like, anyone can run a node, right? Anyone can be a node operator. It's not a difficult thing to do. At scale, it becomes a bit more difficult, right? But the thing is that it's even for individuals, they could probably do this at scale too if they wanted to. So it's not that difficult. So that's why I say that their mode is not actually the product; it's everything else that comes off of that, and that's what the other services need to compete on, right? They need to compete on marketing and branding and liquidity and business development, stuff like that. And we're seeing that play out now. We've seen that play out over the last kind of, especially this year post withdrawals. We've seen it play out in a really big way, and that's my general view on how Lido got to where it is today. We'll see what what it looks like in the future. It's a slow moving ship, right? To turn this thing is like turning a massive cruise liner. It's not going to be a fast process. It's not like turning a bike. So it's going to be a thing that plays out over many years. We may get or may not get various different protocol upgrades that address these things, like the two-tiered staking stuff and other such things like that, like the max effective balance increase, which I think should help a lot as well. Because another big thing that we haven't mentioned is also the fact that these LSTs can compound their stake, whereas solo stakers can't compound their stake unless they are making 32 ETH like a day or something. To make 32 ETH a day from being a solo staker would require a lot of ETH. So with the max effective balance increase, you essentially compound your stake automatically, and there's no need to wait for 32 ETH. So all of your rewards can get compounded, and it could probably be done in a way that is tax optimized too, where you actually don't get taxed because technically you're not taking possession of the ETH, right? It's getting just restaked with what you already have. So from that perspective, I'm in massive favor of that max effective balance increase to help solo stakers, because that's the one thing that actually does help solo stakers. And also for a network health perspective, as I mentioned before, we don't need the number of validators that we have today. We can actually reduce that substantially. Those are my kind of final thoughts. I don't know if you had final thoughts on all of that.
Yeah, no, I will just wrap up by saying I agree with you. That max effective balance change has to happen because as someone that runs multiple validators, it's ridiculous that I have to wait to get another 32 ETH to like, and to your point, like that is a huge benefit. Like that is one reason I've thought about withdrawing and going to liquid staking. I mean, these are all kind of compounding things. And if you can do that in a tax advantage way with that change, I mean, it's huge. So, I mean, this has been a good discussion. I mean, I feel like everybody in the Ethereum should listen to this. I'm like biased, but I feel like that we kind of covered everything in an hour episode, which is hard to do. But it's important to like be loud about it so that people like say, hey, this is what's going on. But at the same time, like Twitter's problem is no one goes and educates themselves, right? So it's good to talk about it all and cover it all.
Yeah, definitely. And as we said at the start, like there's a lot of nuance to these discussions that people miss because you can't get nuance on crypto Twitter. And even if you do, you're probably not going to understand it because it's like a one-way thing. You're not actually discussing this with the people that are saying these things, and there's a lot of bias. There's a lot of tribalism. It's just not a great way to discuss these things. But I'm of the firm belief that like 99% of the stuff that goes on Twitter is like irrelevant or completely irrelevant to reality, and people should maybe not over-index on what they see on Twitter because that doesn't really reflect reality that much, in my opinion. All right. Well, yeah, I guess we'll end it there. So thanks, Eric, for the discussion. I hope people have enjoyed this. We'll hopefully be back in another couple of weeks if we don't rug again, but we'll always be back. We do enjoy having these discussions. But yeah, it's been a good discussion today about a topic that I think has just dominated crypto Twitter, at least over the last couple of weeks. And I hope people learned a lot from it and learned that there is a lot of nuance to these discussions. So yeah, just keeping that in mind when reading all these sorts of things.